Hello and welcome to episode 25 of My Friend the Rainbow Circle. This is episode 25, which is a number I associate with my brother Paul. In honor of my brother Bill, I'm going to try to keep this at 10 minutes. We'll see if that actually works. Seek is now eating the Rainbow Circle, of course. And my brother Paul's, one of his favorite artists is Max Ernst. So I thought of talking about Max Ernst, but today is also Antonin Artaud's birthday. Sika's going to knock everything over. Today's also Antonin Artaud's birthday, and that's a magical coincidence that I didn't even realize when I thought about talking about Max Ernst. They were both at one time surrealists, and the whole idea of being a surrealist is such a complicated concept. Whether or not you're actually welcomed into the group by Andre Breton. He kicked out everybody and welcomed everybody in. The most famous surrealist is Salvador Dali, and he did a lot of his best work when he wasn't actually technically a surrealist. Artaud did his best work after he left the prime group. But I'm still categorizing them in the same group. And my cat is eating a balloon, which seems like a surrealist thing to happen just at random. A cat eating a balloon, and I don't want her to choke on this balloon. So I'm going to take it away from her. Max Ernst was a visual artist. Antonin Artaud, most famous for theater, theory mainly. He was a director and an actor, and he did pretty much everything you could do and writer. He did pretty much everything you could do in theater, and he did poetry, and he did just a wide variety of other things. Performance art, before you called it performance art. So he's the more obvious one that you would associate with literature. Max Ernst did collage comics, and I mean collage books. I'm trying to do collage comics, so that's what I associate them with. But there were collage books composed by free association and randomness and what have you. But I think the most significant thing you can learn from the surrealists, and there's lots of things you can learn from the surrealists, but arguably, this is my argument, it's a complicated argument to try to do in 10 minutes. I'm going to try to keep this at 10 minutes. But all art is surrealism. There's my complicated argument. And everything that's layered on top of that is just an extension out of that surrealist core. So if you look at the center of the rainbow circle, which I call the visceral center or the emotional core or stimulation, disregarding dualistic distinctions, you can associate that with surrealism. But surrealism has become so narrowed down to, especially in the association with Salvador Dali, it's become narrowed down to being dreamlike imagery, which is not necessarily, that's only one really small part of surrealism. The beginning concept of surrealism was that instinctive free association. Maggie's going to be chewing things. My animals just want to make noise constantly. But instinctive free association that sort of consolidated into dream imagery. And dreams are a big part of surrealism. They don't have to be. They don't have to be specifically dreams. It could be subconscious free association. Hold on, I'm going to take away the thing Maggie's chewing, because she's going to make a lot of noise, and that's going to be annoying. No noise, no noise. No noise. Stop. No noise. Hold on. No noise. Stop. She's going to now search for it. And this is going to be what this video is about. The dog trying to get this plastic thing that she's chewing away from me. No. No noise. So anyway, free association and random acts of magic and chaos and wildness. So what you can learn from Max Ernst, I think really what Max Ernst, trying to keep this relatively short, there's tons I could talk about with Max Ernst, but I would say the thing to learn most significantly about Max Ernst is really, it's similar to what Salvador Dali called the paranoid critical method. That's not my favorite word for it. You might call it pareidolia, but hey guys. Hey guys. Yes, I am hiding plastic things. You're both staring at me like I'm hiding plastic things. Paranoid critical method just basically meaning if you see a shape, you turn it into something. So if you see a cloud, you turn it into something. That's the simplest definition. It's a bit more complicated than that. So a lot of Max Ernst stuff, like Europe After the Rain, he came across these textures that caused his subconscious to project images on, project some sense of humanity on, and just pictures like this, pictures like this. I'm not holding them. Hold on. Wait, hold it a little more slowly. There you go. Pictures like that. The Joy of Life. That one's called The Joy of Life. But those are based on, a lot of his collages. He had such a wide variety of different pieces. He had more expressionistic sort of pieces like this. Expressionistic pieces sort of like this. That had more to do with the free association of color. He had, pieces like this, that do have more dream imagery and monsters. He had lots and lots of pictures with monsters that seem to come out of dreams. The Temptation of St. Anthony is one of my favorites. There's just a little piece of the Temptation of St. Anthony. Temptation of St. Anthony is one of my favorites. So he would project these images onto textures through using various techniques that he invented. It would bring up these subconscious monster imagery and what have you. And that's the basic condition of any sort of artist, that you build stuff out of. So if you're projecting the image, projecting humanity onto texture, once you build out of that, once you get to this schematic level, you're structuring that into a story. And this is why I have a problem with metaphor as an idea. I tend to reject metaphorical readings of things because and metaphor tends to be used very, very loosely as a term. But the way I tend to interpret the word metaphor is meaning an image standing in for an abstraction, a cerebral abstraction. Metaphor is a lot more complicated than that and can function a lot of different ways. So, for example, I wrote a story called Crippled Ghosts, and Crippled Ghosts just came out of just meditation on the horribleness of social media, and just the horrible feelings that dredges up. And it starts from just meditations on those feelings, and images boil out of meditations on those feelings. So if, and it ended up being somewhat like social media, just the shape that it took. It had to do with these crystals and connections of minds and things like that. And it ended up being somewhat similar to social media. So you might call that a metaphor for social media. That's not really a metaphor. That's a pareidotic embodiment of a feeling. So it's taking this and giving it a shape based on subconscious processes. So metaphor is, an inaccurate term for that. I have a novel that I wrote called The Living Needle. It's about living scarecrows. And so scarecrows come to life, and it turns out they're really pathetic. And, they're just made of straw, and they have no purpose in life, and they sort of just, become homeless and all this sort of stuff. And so just in a workshop I was told, oh, this must be a metaphor for prejudice. which if you treat it cerebrally and you look at the implications of that as a metaphor, it's a bad metaphor, it's a bad analogy for prejudice, because the scarecrows are genuinely pathetic. They're genuinely, they don't really have brains, genuinely. So treating it as, as a part of an argument about prejudice is, an ineffective way to treat it, whereas taking that core feeling of feeling like you're pathetic, what does, low self-confidence and what have you. I'm obsessed with, of course, The Wizard of Oz. My scarecrow magnet is back here somewhere. And just, recognizing that similarity with the scarecrow character. And the scarecrow character is just a really pathetic sort of character. And he grows a lot more gradually in the book version. In the movie version, he's kind of just, he jumps right into being intelligent when he gets the placebo. But I could go on and on about that. All of these topics I can go on and on about. But, so just really meditating on this, what sort of feelings do I share with the scarecrow, and it built into this world full of these pathetic, brainless scarecrows who, have no self-worth. So it's an embodiment of a feeling, more so than some sort of rational argument, where the metaphor would stand in for some sort of abstraction, or where the metaphor would stand in for something in the quote-unquote real world. So if you look at something like Temptation of St. Anthony, it's, what is the core visceral impulse of the Temptation of St. Anthony? It's pain and terror and all this sort of stuff. Is it really a metaphor for, all these monsters? Are they metaphors for temptations, or are they embodiments of these visceral feelings of temptation and demonic forces tearing you apart and what have you? Speaking of demonic forces tearing you apart, I'm already over 10 minutes. That didn't quite work. I still need practice. Antonin and Artaud. I hate every creative writing textbook I've ever read. The only creative writing textbook I would probably ever assign if I was ever considered cool enough to teach creative writing. Speaking of low self-esteem and self-hatred and all that sort of stuff. No one will ever accept me as a creative writing teacher, I'm sure. But if I ever do, this would be the book that this is #1 draft pick for a creative writing textbook, The Theater and Its Double. It's about the theater. I've never read fiction creative writing textbooks that ever are even remotely valid. Like I've talked about the John Gardner book, which is atrocious book-length pile of garbage. But there is a chapter where, I'm reading through it and it said, garbage, nonsense. He has a chapter where he talks about fiction being a dream. And when I read that, I was like, oh, wait a second. He might be on to a point. Oh, wait, he lost it. I should, I've wanted to do, an in-depth criticism of that book, but it seems like seems like a scarecrow. It's kind of a sad, pathetic book, and it seems like I'm just shooting fish in a barrel. It's not even hard to criticize just how bad everything about that book is. So it seems like, why is it even worth it? But The Theater and Its Double sort of takes that basic idea of surrealism, which is beyond just the dream imagery that you see in Salvador Dali. It's that core visceral impulse, embodying it in free associations like, abstract expressionism, which is visceral abstraction. There's two types of abstraction. I might have talked about this before. Cerebral abstraction up here and visceral abstraction down here. The barrier is reality. I've talked about that before. I should probably, do another video really specifically explaining that point. But Artaud takes that and uses it essentially to talk about what you really need to do in theater, and how theater has become lifeless. And that's the the back and forth forces. And you look at the whole history of any sort of literary development. The the back and forth forces of destimulation. So if something continues and becomes tired, you know, some sort of form becomes tired, like, you know, Artaud is recognizing that in the theater. It's moving towards the destimulating into the spectrum. So you have to revive it by moving it more to the visceral end of the stimulating visceral end of the spectrum. So he's recognizing that, and you can pretty much look at any part of this book and see some kind of wisdom about how to bring life back to the written word, just the same way Ernst and, you know, hundreds of others are bringing life back to the visual medium. Not just in surrealism, but, you know, surrealism is a great place to look for that. This is, my copy was destroyed in the washing machine. I taped it together with splicing tape. I used to work in a movie theater, so I had this splicing tape that I taped it back together. The yellow lines, I used to know what those yellow lines meant. My wife washed that and destroyed it, and that's not the only thing she destroyed in my life. However, compared to all the other things she's destroyed, this is one of the least significant things she's destroyed. This is getting into some complicated territory. So, like, just a real sample of just his basic idea. The contemporary theater is decadent because it has lost the feeling, on the one hand, for seriousness, on the other hand, for laughter, because it has broken away from gravity, from effects that are immediate and painful, in a word, from danger. Because it has lost a sense of real humor, a sense of laughter's power of physical and anarchic disassociation. That's a big thing he talks about, is anarchy, bringing back anarchy in theater, because it has grown tired. Because it anarchic dissociation. There's a great phrase. Because it has broken away from the spirit of profound anarchy, which is at the root of all poetry. It must be admitted that everything in the destination of an object It must be admitted that everything in the destination of an object, in the meaning or the use of natural form, is a matter of convention, and convention brings it closer to the destimulating end of the spectrum. Nature, in giving a tree the form of a tree, could just as well have given it the form of an animal or of a hill. We would have thought tree for the animal or the hill, and the word tree, for the animal or the hill, or the trick would have been turned. It is agreed that a beautiful woman has a melodious voice, you know, kind of sexist language, but Artaud had lots of problems, and, you know, that's not the most significant of his very serious, wide-ranging, complicated personal issues. He's a genius about the theater. In his personal life, you know, he did not live a personal life that you should really emulate in any way whatsoever, arguably. If since the world began we had heard all beautiful women call and the trumpet blasts and greet us like a bellowing elephant, he would have eternally associated the idea of bellowing with the idea of beautiful woman, and a portion of our inner vision of the world would have been radically transformed thereby. This helps us to understand that poetry is anarchic to the degree that it brings into play all the relationships of object to object in the form of signification. It is anarchic also to the degree that its occurrence is the consequence of a disorder that draws us closer to chaos. Very pro-chaos and anarchy. I think he talks about the Marx Brothers. So, I mean, and this is just a random example of you know, the sorts of things he talks about. But essentially what he's talking about there is the whole, and it's a very Western sort of concept of language, of language being subordinate to an abstraction. So, the whole idea that it's conventional, convention has caused our associations with things like, you know, viscerally stimulating things like danger to be abstracted into, you know, these dead words. And so by poetry, as he, you know, in his interpretation, poetry, by disassociating words from these conventional destimulating abstractions, revivifies language. So by breaking down the subordinating relationship of objects to abstraction, or sense imagery to abstraction, to visceral, to cerebral abstraction, that revivifies the language. And so one of the ways of understanding the rainbow circle, this is getting into complicated territory. I'm already at 20 minutes. Still need practice on keeping it 10 minutes. One of the ways to interpret the rainbow circle is as a series of subordination. So if you're, and you can favor it either way. If you're talking about art, you know, you're favoring the center. If you're talking about, you know, some intellectual pursuit, you're favoring the outer rim. But it's a series of subordinations. So, for example, if you're favoring, you know, the cerebral approach of destimulating associations of language with these abstractions, like metaphor, then everything else is subordinated under some sort of universal concept, some sort of abstract universal. And so reality is subordinated under this abstract universal. Emotion is subordinated under that. But if you're talking about an art form, you know, any sort of art, you're flipping that around backwards so that, you know, the highest priority then becomes that visceral core of stimulation of, you know, or of life, you know, and that's a lot of what Artaud talks about, is bringing life back into the language by anarchy against convention, you know, in that sort of excerpt, where life, it becomes the top priority. Life within the language becomes the top priority, and then other things become abstracted or become subordinated under that. So it flips around the relationship of subordination, so that, you know, in my scheme, you know, reality, physical reality becomes, you know, this fifth level subordination from the visceral core. Psychological factors become a fourth level subordination from the visceral core. Schematic, internal rule systems of the art form itself become a third level subordination away from the visceral core, etc. So in that scheme, the universal cerebral abstraction becomes a seventh level subordination away from the visceral core. Well, the rhetorical, and then the sixth level is the you know, the cerebral abstraction, the universalized cerebral abstraction. So, you know, what Artaud is aiming to do is to bring life back to language by total anarchy against, you know, the common sort of hierarchy of favoring the cerebral abstraction. So he does that in the theater, but it's consistent with other forms of surrealism that are doing it in the visual arts. And it's not only really necessary with fiction or any other sort of art form. It's not only necessary, it's the core condition of the vitality of any sort of art form. That you know, that life should be at its core, and you can have all the other elements. You can have all seven. You know, it's perfectly fine. But if you're flipping around that hierarchy and favoring that visceral core, then you can assure that that your art form, whatever it is, has life in it. And that is a positive thing to end the video on. About 25 minutes, so about 15 minutes over my goal. But on the positive, let's end with saying, here's how you bring life into your art form, whatever it is. See you next time.